New York City, spring 1985. A 19-year-old Whitney Houston sits in Clive Davis's office at Arista Records, staring at the contract that will change her life forever. The most powerful man in the music industry has just made her an offer that artists dream about: unlimited studio time, the best producers in the world, a marketing budget that would make her a household name. Everything she's ever wanted is sitting right there on that mahogany desk. But there's a condition, one that will force Whitney to choose between the career of a lifetime and the man she loves. What Clive Davis tells her in that room will haunt Whitney for the rest of her life and ultimately lead to the tragedy that consumed her. This isn't just a story about music contracts and career choices. This is about the moment when a young woman was forced to decide who she was going to be, and how that decision destroyed both the possibilities she chose and the ones she abandoned. Sissy Houston had raised her daughter to understand that talent was a gift from God, but success was earned through discipline and sacrifice. By 1985, Whitney had been singing practically since birth, performing in the New Hope Baptist Church choir, doing backup vocals for her mother, developing a voice that seemed almost supernatural in its power and beauty. Clive Davis had first heard Whitney sing at a small club showcase in 1983. He had been in the music industry for over 20 years, had discovered and developed countless artists, but he later said that hearing Whitney Houston sing for the first time was like witnessing a miracle. Her voice had something he had never encountered before, a combination of gospel power, pop accessibility, and emotional depth that transcended genre and generation. For 2 years, Clive worked with Whitney to prepare her for stardom. Voice coaches, image consultants, songwriting sessions with the industry's best. He was building not just an artist but a phenomenon, someone who could bridge the gap between black and white audiences, between R&B and pop, between art and commerce. But as Whitney developed as an artist, Clive began to notice something that worried him deeply. She had fallen in love with Bobby Brown, a young singer from the group New Edition who was making waves with his own career. Bobby was talented, charismatic, and represented everything that Whitney's carefully constructed image was not. He was street, rough around the edges, unapologetically black in a way that made white executives nervous. The relationship between Whitney and Bobby intensified quickly. They were young, passionate, and found in each other something that balanced their individual struggles. For Bobby, Whitney represented class and sophistication. For Whitney, Bobby represented freedom and authenticity, an escape from the controlled perfection her mother and Clive demanded. Clive Davis watched this relationship develop with growing alarm. He had spent 2 years building Whitney's image as America's sweetheart, the girl next door who happened to have the voice of an angel. Bobby Brown threatened that narrative. His reputation for partying, his growing problems with drugs and alcohol, his public persona that celebrated rebellion rather than respectability, all of it conflicted with the Whitney Houston that Clive was preparing to introduce to the world. In early 1985, as Whitney's debut album was nearing completion, Clive made a decision that would change everything. He called Whitney into his office for what she thought would be a routine meeting about album release strategies. Instead, she walked into an intervention that would force her to make the most difficult choice of her young life. Whitney Houston walked into Clive Davis's office on a bright April morning, excited to hear the final mixes of songs that would comprise her debut album. She was 19 years old, in love, and on the verge of achieving everything she had worked toward her entire life. What she didn't know was that Clive had spent the previous week gathering intelligence about her relationship with Bobby Brown. He had reports from private investigators about Bobby's drug use, his financial problems, his volatile behavior. He had talked to Sissy Houston, who shared his concerns about the relationship but felt powerless to influence her strong-willed daughter. He had consulted with other executives at Arista Records, all of whom agreed that Bobby Brown was a liability that could destroy Whitney's career before it even began. "Whitney," Clive said as she sat down, his tone more serious than she had ever heard. "We need to talk about your future." For the next hour, Clive laid out his concerns with the calculated precision of someone who had spent decades managing artists' careers and public images. He explained how the music industry worked, how image was as important as talent, how one wrong association could derail even the most promising career. He showed her the marketing research his team had compiled, data showing that Whitney's crossover appeal depended on her being seen as safe, wholesome, and respectable. He explained that Bobby Brown, regardless of his personal qualities, represented a threat to that image. His reputation for drugs and partying, his legal troubles, his association with a grittier, more street-oriented form of R&B, all of it would contaminate the carefully crafted brand they had been building. Whitney listened in growing disbelief and anger. She had trusted Clive, had seen him as a mentor and father figure. Now he was sitting there telling her who she could and couldn't love, making her personal life a business decision. "With all due respect, Mr. Davis," Whitney said, her voice tight with emotion, "my relationship with Bobby is my business. It has nothing to do with my music or my career." Clive's expression remained calm but firm. "Everything about you is connected to your career now, Whitney. That's what you signed up for when you agreed to let me develop you as an artist. Your image, your associations, your public life, it all matters. It all affects your ability to sell records and reach the audience you deserve." He paused, then delivered the ultimatum that would define the rest of Whitney's life. "I'm going to be very clear with you because I respect you too much to be anything less than honest. If you continue your relationship with Bobby Brown, I cannot in good conscience move forward with your album release. The investment we've made in you, the team we've assembled, the marketing strategy we've developed, all of it depends on you being the Whitney Houston we've been building, not Bobby Brown's girlfriend." The room fell silent. Whitney stared at Clive in shock, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You're telling me I have to choose between Bobby and my career," she whispered. "I'm telling you that choices have consequences," Clive replied. "You can have Bobby Brown and a modest career singing backup and doing small club gigs. Or you can have the career we've been preparing for, the one that will make you one of the biggest artists in the world. But you cannot have both." Whitney Houston left Clive Davis's office in a state of shock. She didn't go home. Instead, she drove aimlessly through New York City, trying to process what had just happened. The man she trusted, the mentor who had promised to make her a star, had just given her an ultimatum that felt like betrayal. She thought about her mother, Sissy, who had sacrificed so much of her own career to raise Whitney and her brothers. Sissy had been a phenomenal singer in her own right, had worked with Elvis and Aretha, but had never achieved solo stardom. She had poured all of her unrealized dreams into her daughter, had pushed Whitney relentlessly toward excellence. What would Sissy say if Whitney walked away from this opportunity for a relationship? She thought about Bobby, who made her laugh, who saw her as Whitney the person rather than Whitney the voice. With him, she didn't have to be perfect. She could be messy, complicated, real. He represented a life where she could choose her own path, rather than following the script others had written for her. But she also thought about the voice inside her, the gift she had been given, the responsibility that came with that gift. Was it selfish to throw away the opportunity to share that voice with the world just because she loved someone who didn't fit into the industry's narrow definition of acceptable? For 2 weeks, Whitney agonized over the decision. She talked to Bobby, who was hurt and angry at Clive's ultimatum but tried to be supportive. "I don't want to be the reason you don't chase your dreams," Bobby told her. "But I also don't want you to give up on us because some suit thinks he knows what's best for you." She talked to Sissy, who made her position clear. "Whitney, you've been given a gift that comes along once in a generation. You have a responsibility to use that gift. Men come and go, but your voice is forever. Don't throw away everything we've worked for." The pressure was immense, coming from all sides. Clive called regularly, always professional but increasingly urgent. The album was ready. The marketing campaign was planned. Radio stations were waiting. Everything was in place except for Whitney's decision. Finally, on a rainy afternoon in May 1985, Whitney made her choice. She called Clive Davis and told him she would end her relationship with Bobby Brown. She would be the Whitney Houston that Arista Records was prepared to market to the world. She would sacrifice her heart for her voice. Clive's relief was palpable. "You've made the right decision," he told her. "I promise you, Whitney, you won't regret this. We're going to make you the biggest star in the world." But as Whitney hung up the phone and prepared to break Bobby's heart, she already felt the weight of regret settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had chosen her career, but in doing so, she had learned a devastating lesson. Her life was no longer her own. Every choice, every relationship, every moment would now be filtered through the lens of what was best for Whitney Houston, the brand. Whitney Houston, the person, had just been sacrificed on the altar of fame. The breakup with Bobby Brown was devastating for both of them. Whitney delivered the news in person, sitting in Bobby's small apartment, trying to explain why she was choosing her career over their relationship. Bobby was hurt, but not surprised. He had seen this coming from the moment Clive Davis had started taking a more active interest in Whitney's personal life. "They're going to control you," Bobby warned her. "They're going to turn you into something you're not, and one day you're going to wake up and not recognize yourself." Whitney wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but she couldn't, because deep down, she knew he was right. She was already feeling the transformation beginning, the way her authentic self was being smoothed away and replaced with the polished, perfect image that Clive and the marketing team had created. Whitney Houston's debut album was released in February 1985 and became one of the most successful debut albums in music history. The singles, "Saving All My Love for You," "How Will I Know," and "Greatest Love of All," dominated radio and MTV. Whitney became exactly what Clive had promised, the biggest star in the world. But the success came with a price that became clearer with each passing year. Whitney had to carefully monitor every aspect of her public persona, had to maintain the image of perfection that had made her so marketable. There was no room for mistakes, no space for the messy reality of being human. The pressure was enormous, and Whitney began to crack under its weight. She turned to pills to manage the anxiety, to help her sleep after exhausting promotional tour, to give her energy during back-to-back recording sessions. Meanwhile, Bobby Brown's own career continued to evolve. He left New Edition and launched a successful solo career, embracing his bad boy image and finding commercial success with a more authentic, if rougher, presentation. He was everything Whitney had been told she couldn't be, unapologetically himself, flaws and all. The two maintained contact over the years, their connection never fully severed despite the breakup. In 1989, 4 years after Whitney had chosen her career over their relationship, she and Bobby reconnected. Whitney was at the peak of her success, but she was also deeply unhappy. The perfection that had made her famous had become a prison, and she was desperate for something real, something authentic. Despite knowing it would conflict with the image Clive and Arista had worked so hard to build, Whitney began dating Bobby again. This time, she wasn't asking permission. She was taking back control of her personal life, asserting her right to choose love over career strategy. Clive Davis was furious but powerless. Whitney was now too big a star for him to issue ultimatums. She had delivered hit after hit, had become one of the most successful artists in Arista's history. He couldn't threaten to shelve her career anymore, but he made his displeasure clear. "You're making a mistake," he told Whitney. "This relationship is going to destroy everything we've built." Whitney's response was defiant. "Maybe it's time to build something different. Maybe it's time for people to see the real me." Whitney and Bobby married in 1992, and their relationship became one of the most scrutinized in entertainment history. The media portrayed Bobby as the corrupting influence, the bad boy who was destroying America's sweetheart. What they didn't understand, what Clive had always refused to acknowledge, was that Whitney's self-destructive behavior had started long before Bobby came back into her life. The drugs, the erratic behavior, the slow destruction of her voice, these weren't Bobby's influence. They were Whitney's response to years of living under impossible pressure, of being forced to be someone she wasn't, of sacrificing her authentic self for an image that was slowly suffocating her. Bobby didn't introduce Whitney to drugs, but he did give her permission to stop pretending to be perfect, to let the facade drop, to be messy and complicated and human. In a twisted way, the relationship that everyone blamed for Whitney's downfall was actually her attempt to reclaim the authentic life she had given up when she chose her career over love in 1985. The irony wasn't lost on Whitney. She had broken up with Bobby the first time to protect her career and her image. Now, being with Bobby was destroying both. But she stayed anyway, because being with him, even in their dysfunction, felt more real than anything else in her life. Clive watched the destruction with a mixture of frustration and heartbreak. He had created a star, but he had also created a trap. The perfection he had demanded from Whitney had become unsustainable, and now she was collapsing under the weight of it. In interviews years later, Clive would express regret about the pressure he had put on Whitney, about the ultimatum he had given her in 1985. "I was trying to protect her career," he said, "but I didn't fully understand the personal cost of what I was asking her to give up." Whitney's voice, the instrument that had made her famous, began to deteriorate from years of drug abuse and strain. The power and clarity that had defined her recordings in the 1980s gave way to a raspy, damaged sound that made performing her own songs increasingly difficult. She knew what she was losing. Every time she struggled to hit a note that used to come effortlessly, every time she heard the disappointment in fans' reactions, she was reminded of the choice she had made 20 years earlier. She had sacrificed her heart for her voice, and now she was losing both. The final years of Whitney's life were marked by attempts at comeback. Periods of sobriety followed by devastating relapses, and a growing sense that she had somehow lost herself along the way. She and Bobby divorced in 2007, ending a relationship that had been both deeply loving and profoundly destructive. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found dead in a hotel bathtub in Beverly Hills. She was 48 years old. The official cause was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. Clive Davis was scheduled to host his annual pre-Grammy party that night. When he received the news of Whitney's death, he faced another impossible decision: cancel the party or continue as planned. He chose to continue, turning the celebration into a memorial for the artist he had discovered and developed. His decision was controversial, with many seeing it as disrespectful to Whitney's memory. But in a way, it was fitting. Whitney's entire career had been about putting the show first, about maintaining the image even when the person behind it was falling apart. In the weeks following Whitney's death, Clive Davis gave numerous interviews reflecting on their relationship and her career. He spoke about her incredible talent, her professionalism, her impact on music history. But he rarely spoke about the ultimatum he had given her in 1985, about the choice he had forced her to make between love and career. Some people close to Whitney believed that decision was the beginning of her destruction, that by forcing her to sacrifice her authentic self for an image, Clive had created an impossible standard that Whitney spent the rest of her life trying to maintain. The pressure of being perfect, of being America's sweetheart, of never making mistakes or showing vulnerability, had been too much to bear. Others argue that Whitney's success justified the sacrifice, that she had touched millions of lives with her music, and that her legacy would outlive any personal struggles, that the choice Clive had forced her to make had been difficult but necessary. The truth, as with most complex human stories, probably lies somewhere in between. Whitney Houston was one of the greatest voices of our time, an artist who changed the landscape of popular music and inspired generations. But she was also a woman who struggled under the weight of expectations, who spent her life trying to reconcile the person she was with the image others needed her to be. The ultimatum Clive Davis gave her in 1985 wasn't the sole cause of her eventual destruction, but it set a pattern that would define the rest of her life. It taught her that love had to be sacrificed for success, that authentic emotion had to be subordinated to public image, that Whitney, the person, mattered less than Whitney, the brand. Looking back at the choice Whitney made in that spring of 1985, it's impossible not to wonder what would have happened if she had made a different decision. If she had chosen Bobby Brown over Clive Davis, if she had walked away from the stardom that Arista was offering, would she still be alive today? Would she have had a smaller career but a happier life? Or would she have ended up resenting the sacrifice, bitter about the opportunities she had given up for a relationship that might not have lasted anyway? These are questions without answers, parallel universes we can never access. What we do know is that the choice itself, the ultimatum Clive forced upon her, represented everything wrong with how the music industry treats artists, particularly young women, particularly Black women who are expected to be twice as perfect to receive half the recognition. Whitney Houston deserved better than being forced to choose between her heart and her voice. She deserved mentors who understood that protecting her humanity was as important as developing her talent. She deserved an industry that celebrated her authentic self rather than demanding she sacrifice it for marketability. In the years since Whitney's death, the conversation about how we treat artists has begun to change. There's more awareness now about mental health, about the pressure of fame, about the importance of allowing artists to be fully human rather than requiring them to maintain impossible standards of perfection. But that awareness came too late for Whitney, who spent her life trapped between the person she was and the person everyone needed her to be. Clive Davis's ultimatum in 1985 changed music history. It launched one of the most successful careers in popular music and gave the world a voice that will be remembered for generations. But it also contributed to the destruction of the woman behind that voice, a young girl who was forced to choose between love and fame and spent the rest of her life paying the price for that choice. The legacy of that decision is complicated. Whitney Houston's music has brought joy to millions, has been the soundtrack to countless lives, has inspired generations of artists. Her voice was indeed a gift, one that deserved to be shared with the world. But was it worth the personal cost? Was her talent so important that she was required to sacrifice her chance at authentic love and happiness? These are questions each of us must answer for ourselves. In the end, the story of Clive Davis's Ultimatum and Whitney's Choice is about more than just one artist and one manager. It's about the price we ask people to pay for their gifts, about the way we consume talent without considering the human cost, about the impossible standards we impose on those who entertain us. Whitney Houston gave us her voice, but we demanded she also give us perfection. When she couldn't maintain that standard, when her humanity showed through the carefully constructed image, we judged her harshly. We forgot that the voice that moved us came from a person, someone who struggled and hurt and made mistakes just like the rest of us. Clive Davis made a calculation in 1985. He believed that Whitney's talent was so extraordinary that it justified demanding she sacrifice her personal happiness for her career. He believed that the image they were building was necessary for her success, that Bobby Brown represented a threat that had to be eliminated. He may have been right about the commercial calculation. Whitney's career was indeed phenomenal, and there's no way to know if she would have achieved the same level of success if she had made different choices. But commercial success isn't the only measure of a life well lived, and in focusing so intently on building Whitney's career, Clive and others in her life may have lost sight of the person they were supposed to be protecting. The tragedy of Whitney Houston is that she was both incredibly successful and deeply unhappy, that she achieved everything she was supposed to want but never found peace. The ultimatum she faced at 19 set her on a path that led to extraordinary professional achievement and profound personal destruction. We'll never know what would have happened if she had made a different choice, if she had walked away from Clive's ultimatum and chosen love over fame. Maybe she would have been happier. Maybe she would have had a smaller career but a longer life. Or maybe she would have found a way to have both, to maintain her authentic self while still sharing her incredible gift with the world. What we do know is that the choice she was forced to make, the sacrifice demanded of her, was fundamentally unfair. No one should have to choose between love and career, between authenticity and success, between their heart and their voice. Whitney Houston deserved better. She deserved an industry that valued her humanity as much as her talent. She deserved mentors who protected her person as carefully as they cultivated her career. She deserved the freedom to make mistakes, to be complicated, to live a full and authentic life without fearing it would destroy everything she had worked for. The ultimatum Clive Davis gave her in 1985 wasn't the only factor in Whitney's eventual destruction, but it was symbolic of a larger problem, the way we treat talented people as products to be managed rather than humans to be supported. Until we change that fundamental dynamic, Whitney's story will continue to repeat itself with new artists, new voices, new talents sacrificed on the altar of commercial success. This is the legacy of that spring day in 1985, when a 19-year-old girl was forced to choose between her voice and her heart. She chose her voice, gave the world the gift of her incredible talent, and spent the rest of her life wondering what she had lost in the process. The music remains, beautiful and powerful and timeless, but the woman who created it is gone, and we're left with the uncomfortable question of whether the price she paid was worth what we received.